Andrade from the Liberal Arts Department here at the CMI. And today I'll be joined by Dr. Elizabeth Switaj. She is the chair of the Liberal Arts Department at CMI as well. And we're going to be speaking about James Joyce and his literary significance. Hello, Elizabeth. Welcome.
Hi, thank you.
Who was James Joyce and why is he so important?
Oh, wow, that's a big question. So James Joyce was an Irish writer, but he was also a very European writer. Sometimes we refer to him as an Italianate Irishman, because after he graduated from university, he lived most of his life in Italy and then later in Paris. But it was Italy that was the most formative for him, particularly in what was then the very cosmopolitan city of Trieste. His significance...
I mean, he wrote a lot of books.
Yeah,
right?
well, he didn't actually write very many.
Well, very important books,
Yeah.
at least two of them.
Yeah, I think his significance is that he brought the specific situation of Ireland to global modernism, to these new innovations that were happening in how you write.
Right.
And he brought the matter of Ireland into that, but he also brought it into a European context. And of course, right now, the issue of what a European context means is
that's
huge.
A big thing, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely, especially after Brexit. Now, this was during the first half of the 20th century.
That's right.
And back then, Southern Ireland was not still an independent country.
That's right.
So he was born being a subject of the British Empire.
Right, and in fact, he kept his British passport even after Irish independence, which leads to a lot of discussion, we could say friendly discussion,
Okay.
about whether he should be considered a British writer or an Irish writer.
Was he a nationalist in any sense? An Irish nationalist?
Oh, that is also a very complicated question. He was very critical of the Irish nationalists, especially the cultural nationalists. He had a very strong issue with those who said, well, you should speak the Irish language because it's your language.
Right.
You know, he had grown up, like everybody else, pretty much speaking English, so he felt that was his language. But would he have been a nationalist in a different context?
Was he happy with independence when independence was finally achieved?
Oh, wow.
Did he get to see the independence?
He did see independence.
So he died after
saw
independence.
the Free State.
All right. So was he happy about that?
Well, he wasn't happy about the Free State.
Okay.
But a lot of people were not happy about the Free
Right.
State. And he was unhappy about it in kind of a strange way. He did visit Ireland during the Civil War, and there was an incident where people were shooting at a train as part of the Civil War, but he believed they were shooting at him personally, or at least that's what he wrote in the letters. So he wasn't happy with the Free State, but I wouldn't say he was unhappy that Ireland was independent.
Well, as with any nationalisms, it's complicated, right?
It is, yeah, yeah.
Let's talk about his books. His two most famous books, Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake,
Mm-hmm.
they are notoriously difficult to read.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would say extremely so. What was he after writing in such a difficult style?
Sure. I think part of what he was after was a kind of complexity where the book itself is no longer the authority on itself. It, at least with Finnegan's Wake, it's so open to interpretation. It almost drives you to misinterpretation. Ulysses doesn't quite go that far. And as Hugh Kenner said, it's kind of a Berlitz language lesson. It's actually showing you, okay, I'm going to start with very traditional 19th century narrative and move slowly away from that in ways that are more and more outlandish. So in a way, that is the book that is preparing people for the greater freedoms and the different way of reading of Finnegan's Wake.
Right. He was innovating with some new techniques, like going inside characters' heads, and just writing whatever was inside their heads, even if it sometimes doesn't make sense. And this is called sometimes the stream of consciousness or something like that.
Sure.
What's that about?
Sure. Well, stream of consciousness, it's not really about how we think, but it's a meaningful simulation of how we think. It's how we might think if we were thinking through text rather than thinking verbally or in pictures. But he was not, in fact, the first one to use it. He actually borrowed that off of a very obscure French writer. And that's one of the things about Joyce is very little that he did was original. He just was usually the second person to do it, and he brought it into that Irish context, that European context, and he combined the different techniques.
Does it ever get to the point of absurdity, the stuff that he writes?
Oh, yeah.
The reader says, what the hell is this about?
Oh, of course it does, deliberately so.
Right. But I mean, would we call it even surrealism in the sense that, you get lost and, you have no idea what's going on there, and kind of like a Dali painting? I mean, are they in the same genre, would you say?
I wouldn't say so, because even if you go to the most challenging passages in Finnegan's Wake, you can find a thread.
Which, is different from surrealism. In surrealism, you just get completely lost.
I mean, where they do connect is especially with Finnegan's Wake. There's the idea that Ulysses is one day, so it's the book of the day. Finnegan's Wake is the book of the night. So of course you get dreams, and that is the connection to surrealism.
Is there any way that the Marshallese could relate to James Joyce?
Yes, very much so, and I'd say especially starting with Dubliners, Joyce's book of short stories that he wrote starting when he had just recently completed university, but that took a couple decades to actually get published, and he was fiddling with it after that. Dubliners, it's very much in a realist style, although you can see some glimmers of what would come later. And it shows just the life in a country that's been colonized over the centuries, that's experiencing modernity for the first time.
Right.
There's a lot in there. I've taught this very often in my literature classes, and very often I have
here at the
say,
CMI?
yes, and they'll point to
but
things
I wonder
and say,
how
it's just like
students
us.
whose first language is not English, as it's also my case,
Sure.
how do they relate to such difficult text? Now, Dubliners may not be as
Yeah.
difficult, but I've been speaking English for many years. I think I have a good command of English, but I must confess that both Ulysses and Finnegan's
Sure.
Wake, they're very difficult for me. Now, I guess this would be even more so for our Marshallese students here who are learning English maybe for the first time being as adults.
Sure, absolutely. But many of the best readers of Ulysses, of Finnegan's Wake even, are people who speak English as a later language. Fritz Sen, who is the senior reader of Ulysses, is not an academic. And he's actually argued that second language English speakers are the best readers of Joyce because they're kind of used to not understanding everything. And maybe that's the biggest challenge, is being able to accept,
Right.
hey, I don't have to master this text.
Right. What has been the reaction of the students, of the Marshallese students, when they read these texts? What did they tell you about Joyce?
Well, I had one student who made a very great comment. He said, it's almost like Joyce is stalking these people, which I just thought was such a wonderful way of expressing how Joyce really does get into the heads and the lives of ordinary people.
Right. Well, I'll tell you one thing. I mean, being here in the Marshall Islands, and of course I've been here for a very short time compared to you, who have been, quite a few years. I see that the Marshallese relationship to the American is very complex. And
Yes.
I suppose it's the very same relationship that Joyce had to the British.
Mhm.
I mean, the Marshallese may resent all the nuclear tests and, and other imperialist abuses.
Sure.
But on the other hand, they realize that, America is still part of their identity,
Sure.
for good or for bad. And I suppose it was the same with Joyce regarding the crown, right?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, there's this idea of the metro-colonial, a colony that is sort of part of the ruling country. It's that close to it that it's almost part of it. And part of that is that it becomes part of your identity if you're one of the colonial subjects. But there's also an issue of how are you complicit then, if you can go over and get almost the same rights as a citizen. And there's actually a great word that shows up in Finnegan's Wake, semi-colonials.
Elizabeth, we've run out of time, but this has
All
been a
right.
wonderful conversation. And whenever you want to return to talk to us, you're most welcome to do it.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
And thank you guys for having watched this video, and I hope to see you some next time. Liberal Arts Department here at the CMI. And today I'll be joined by Dr. Elizabeth Switaj. She is the chair of the Liberal Arts Department at CMI as well. And we're going to be speaking about James Joyce and his literary significance. Hello, Elizabeth. Welcome.
Hi, thank you.
Who was James Joyce and why is he so important?
Oh, wow, that's a big question. So James Joyce was an Irish writer, but he was also a very European writer. Sometimes we refer to him as...
I mean, he wrote a lot of books.
Yeah,
right?
well, he didn't actually write very many.
Well, very important books,
Yeah.
at least two of them.
Yeah, I think his significance is that he brought the specific situation of Ireland to global modernism, to these new innovations that were happening in how you write.
Right.
And he brought the matter of Ireland into that. But he also brought it into a European context. And of course, right now, the issue of what a European context means is
that's
huge.
A big thing, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely, especially after Brexit. Now, this was during the first half of the 20th century.
That's right, as an Italianate Irishman, because after he graduated from university, he lived most of his life in Italy and then later in Paris. But it was Italy that was the most formative for him, particularly in what was then the very cosmopolitan city of Trieste. His significance